Slowly, the monster began to approach her. She didn't let go of the gun and silently, little by little, she started walking backwards. With a surprised look, she began to wonder when this monster had appeared behind her. After taking several steps back, her butt collided with the edge of the wooden table that was behind her. While sweat was dripping from her face, she slightly turned her head to the side, and upon seeing a wooden table behind her, she panicked and thought that this was not good, as now she had no escape. She remembered that she still had the gun. Thinking this, she decided to use it to eliminate the monster. She tightly grabbed the gun and slowly began to lift it, but at that moment, it collided with the chair next to it. Due to how quickly she was moving her hand, the gun fell out of her hand and started rolling across the table. She slowly turned her head back, and upon seeing this, her expression changed drastically. With a terrified look, she thought that there was no escape left. Upon hearing the sound of the gun rolling across the table, with a penetrating gaze, the monster began to approach her. It opened its mouth, started roaring, and prepared to attack her. Upon seeing this, she thought she was dead. She brought her hands close to her chest, closed her eyes, and prepared herself to receive the monster's attack. But luckily for her, instead of attacking her, it took a strong bite out of the chair next to her. Several seconds later, it stopped biting the chair, turned its head towards her, and began smelling the perfume she was wearing. Upon seeing that the monster had not attacked her, she opened one of her eyes, and upon realizing that it was sniffing her, she began to wonder what was happening and what this monster was doing. Immediately, she placed her hands on the table, spread her legs, and started leaning back to avoid colliding with the monster. It opened its nose and began to smell even more strongly. Doon turned her head towards it, and upon seeing this, she began to wonder if it had been smelling with its nose the whole time. She came to the conclusion that it couldn't see. Upon seeing this, she thought she had narrowly escaped. At that moment, the monster started following her scent and began getting closer to her. While she still had her legs on the ground, she lay down on the table, turned her head to one side, closed one eye, clenched her teeth tightly, and being so close to the monster, she couldn't help but sweat. Now it was too close to her, which means it would react to any sound she made. She started thinking about what to do now. The monster opened its mouth and slowly approached Doon. She climbed onto the table, extending her hand towards the gun with a hopeful look in her eyes. She thought that as long as she had a weapon, she would be able to defeat the monster. She began reaching for the gun to grab it, but unfortunately for her, it was too far away. Despite this setback, she was not willing to give up. Despite her efforts to extend her arm as much as she could, in the end, she got tired and her arm hit the table. Upon hearing the sound, the monster began to approach her head. While she had one hand resting on the table, she turned her head to one side, and upon seeing it getting closer, she couldn't help but sweat. With a worried look, she thought that she was dead. At that moment, the monster finally realized that there was a person nearby. While Doon had her entire body on the table and was reaching out for the gun, she turned her head upwards, and upon seeing that the monster had noticed her presence, she went into shock. She began to look at it with a terrified gaze and thought that this was not good. It opened its mouth and began to approach her quickly, preparing to attack. At that moment, the only thought that came to her mind were memories of Su Chen. A few days ago, while Su Chen had his hand under his chin and his eyes closed, he explained to her that his resources were limited, so he couldn't just stay with her because she was beautiful. He closed his eyes and explained to her that if she found the crystal that was inside the monster's brain, then she would obtain powers. Su Chen turned his head towards her, and with a serious look, he told her that he didn't want garbage around him. While little by little the monster was getting closer to her, she turned her body towards it, started staring at it aggressively, clenched her teeth tightly, and decided not to be a loser. Just before the monster could attack her, she put her leg in front, stabbing its eye with the heel, causing intense pain. She drove the heel into it with such force that the tip came out through its head. While she had her body leaning on the table, she forcefully drove the heel into the monster's head. Then she started staring at it with a look full of hatred, clenched her teeth tightly, and began moving the heel from side to side to cause even more damage. Several seconds later, she pulled the heel out of the monster's eye, and due to intense pain, it opened its mouth and started screaming in agony. She began to move her foot away from the monster's head, but at that moment, it moved at high speed and grabbed her foot tightly with its hand. Upon seeing this, her expression changed drastically. She started staring disdainfully at the monster and couldn't help but get angry. She didn't know how it was still alive if she had pierced its skull with the heel. She became furious and started repeatedly stabbing the monster in the eye with her heel again. causing it to open its mouth and scream in agony once more. Several seconds later, she pulled her heel out of the monster's eye, causing its body to start falling backwards. In a matter of seconds, it turned its head to one side and due to the pain, fell to its knees on the ground. Doon sat at the table, placed both hands on top, and while watching as its body slowly fell to the ground, she simply remained silent. There was a fire axe in the office. She thought it was a shame because if Su Chen had seen her doing this, he would have thought that she wasn't a loser. In a matter of seconds, the monster fell to the ground and lost its life. Doon grabbed the axe with her hand, rested it on her shoulder, approached it, put her foot on its head, started staring at it with a serious look and decided to check if it was true that monsters had a crystal core in their brain. That same afternoon, at the engineering university, Bai Kang and Lu Xiaofeng followed Su Chen's order and began organizing the evacuation of the students. Bai Kang specifically contacted her brother, Bai Ming, to bring his army and join her in protecting the students. Bai Ming put the weapon on his shoulder, began holding the rope with his hand, turned his head towards the girls' dormitory, and with a serious look remained silent, wondering if they should really listen to this Su Chen guy. Bai Kang, who was holding the weapon with both hands, turned her head towards her brother and with a serious look on her face, began to wonder what he was doing. At the same time, in the reptile biology laboratory, Wang Jin, the snake that Su Chen was very interested in, started to mutate. Several hours later, Su Chen went to the laboratory and took the snake out of its cage, and it raised its head and started staring at him intently. Su Chen approached the snake with a serious look on his face, deciding to see how far it could mutate. He decided to prepare a large bucket specifically for this purpose. Su Chen filled a large bucket of water and placed it near the table where the snake was. Just before he could make a move, the snake started approaching the bucket of water, sticking out its tongue and looking at its reflection. He quickly realized that it also knew it had to enter the water to complete the mutation. Seeing this, he thought that it had saved him from having to do it himself. The snake began to put its head inside the water bucket, and little by little its body started to mutate and grow bigger. With a murderous look, it opened its mouth. Now its teeth were much larger and sharper. The snake slowly began to put its entire body inside the bucket. In a matter of seconds, its whole body started to mutate, and the bucket gradually began to break. Su Chen, who was staring at the snake with a surprised look, couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and wonder what was happening. Several seconds later, the snake completely mutated, causing the water cube to explode. Su Chen put his hand near his face and began to wonder what was happening. The snake that was once just an ordinary snake has now transformed into a giant water snake. It opened its mouth and started staring at Su Chen. While his body was emitting a suffocating and powerful energy, he began to approach the snake. He dropped his arms to the sides, and upon seeing that it had grown so much with just an initial mutation, he couldn't help but feel relieved. Fortunately, he had only given the snake a bucket of water. If a flood came and it entered the water, then it would grow and mutate even more. Su Chen put one hand in his pants pocket and with the other pulled out a sword from the system's inventory. He stared intently at the snake and told it that if it obeyed him, then he would consider having it as a pet. The snake knew it had no chance of winning against Su Chen, so just before he could finish speaking, the snake gathered momentum and started heading towards the laboratory window to escape the area. While holding the sword with one hand, he placed his other hand near his face, and upon seeing that the snake was trying to flee, he was somewhat surprised. With a surprised look, he began to watch as it slowly made its way towards the window and didn't take long to come to the conclusion that it had developed intelligence thanks to mutation. The snake decided to escape from the area. It broke the laboratory window, opened its mouth, and with a penetrating gaze, started descending towards the ground. But for its bad luck, Su Chen was not going to let this happen. He gathered momentum, took a leap, went outside through the window and started following it. Su Chen grabbed the sword with both hands, started staring at the snake intently, clenched his teeth tightly and began to question if this was what they called snake movement. But it was a pity for him because its speed wasn't fast enough. In the blink of an eye, Su Chen approached it and forcefully stabbed the sword into the snake's body, but to his misfortune, the blade of the sword broke as soon as it made contact with its skin. Su Chen began to look at its scales and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. He approached the broken sword, looked at the blade, and with a confused expression began to wonder why the snake's scales were so hard. While he was lost in his thoughts, the snake took advantage of this and in the blink of an eye approached him, opened its mouth, started staring at him intently, and with a murderous look prepared to attack. Just before the snake could attack, Su Chen moved at high speed and swiftly moved to one side, dodging the attack in the process. He extended a hand towards the ground, clenched his other fist, and prepared to attack. Now that the sword didn't work against the snake's scales, with a serious look on his face, he decided to kill it using only his fists. The snake turned its head to one side, and upon seeing that Su Chen had dodged the attack, it was shocked and couldn't help but question what was happening. Just before it could make a move, Su Chen delivered a strong punch to its head, causing its body to forcefully collide with the ground, shattering it into pieces in the process. As he was in midair, the snake's body began to coil around Su Chen's body. He turned his head to one side and upon seeing this, became somewhat confused and started wondering what was happening. Just before he could move away and do something about it, the snake coiled its body around Su Chen's body, trapping him and rendering him immobile. He clenched his teeth tightly, turned his head to the side, started looking at the snake's scales, and with a surprised look thought that he was trapped. It didn't take long for him to come to the conclusion that this snake was very clever. After wrapping its body around Su Chen's, the snake began to stare at him and move closer. He turned his head to the side, and upon realizing that it was approaching, he simply remained silent and realized that the previous attack had only been a distraction, and that its true objective was to make him lose focus in order to trap him. Now that Su Chen couldn't move, the snake approached him, opened its mouth, and prepared to deliver the final blow. As it slowly approached, he simply turned his head to the side and started looking at the ground. At the same time, Bai Kang and her brother finally evacuated all the students. While they were walking in the area, he slightly turned his head back and saw that she was still looking around. With a worried look, he asked his sister if something was bothering her and also if she was worried because she didn't want to leave handsome Su Chen behind. Bai Kang, who had her hands on her waist, turned her head to the side and with a serious look explained to him that no one would take him for a fool if he didn't speak. Bai Ming grabbed the weapon's rope with his hand, turned his body towards her and with a serious look asked her if she really liked Su Chen so much. He also added that if Su Chen stayed here, then he would be doomed to die. Bai Kang turned her head towards him and with a serious look, she told him that Su Chen was not going to die. Upon hearing this, he asked her if she was sure. She approached him, started staring at him intently, and explained that the first time she saw Su Chen, she realized he was strong. To her, his deep eyes were mysterious and unfathomable, like those of a monster. She was convinced that they were going to see each other again. At the same time, outside the laboratory where the fight between Su Chen and the mutant snake was taking place, he activated his powers and began reaching out towards it. Just before it could attack him, he grabbed it by the neck and started strangling it. As a result, the snake loosened its grip, releasing Su Chen's body in the process. He began to stare at the snake and asked if it really believed it could catch him this way. He had heard that snakes' nerves were highly developed. Even if their heads were cut off, they could still bite people. He asked what would happen if this didn't happen. Upon hearing this, the snake couldn't help but panic and start sweating. He tightly grabbed it by the neck and with tremendous force began to twist its body from side to side, causing it to collide with the buildings that were around. Due to this, the snake began to lose consciousness. Then, with a serious look, he forcefully struck its body against the ground. In a matter of seconds, it lost its life. Su Chen approached it, put his foot on its lower jaw, grabbed the upper part with his hand and exerting some force, split its body in half. Several seconds later, Su Chen took a small crystal from the snake's corpse. While his body was emitting a powerful energy, he put one hand in his pants pocket and brought the crystal close to his face with the other. With a serious look, he decided to see what kind of powers it could give him. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.